G'day everyone. People always ask me, how do I get such clean images when I'm shooting at weddings and things like that, seeing I have such high ISO and things like that. The way that I'm tending to shoot now is I'm using less and less flash and shooting natural light in weddings and things like that, because I like to use the ambient light. Sometimes if I can, I will use something like my Profoto B10, which has a continuous light there, or other continuous lights. If I'm outdoors, I do use flash though, but when I like to get into these ambient areas like churches and receptions and things like that, I do always like to use the ambient light that's there. And in fact, I've found that the high ISO of today's cameras are really amazing as long as you expose correctly. And I wanted to show that to you today, what I basically do, because it's all about the exposure that you get on these cameras. Now, the secret too is I use aperture mode when I'm inside the church, and I just set auto ISO and have it ranging between 100 and to 128,000 ISO, and then just let it run whatever it needs to, as long as I'm making sure that I don't underexpose. That's the key, because remember, noise is sitting in your shadows. So the reason why you have to not underexpose, because if you do have to bring the exposure up too much, you will really see the noise sitting in those shadows the second you try and raise the exposure. So exposure is critical, and that's the thing, you really have to almost nail it. It's okay to go up a little bit, but not much, and I try to avoid going up. I usually try to allow for half a stop to go up. And then obviously you can do a little bit of noise reduction. Now, I've added noise reduction in Lightroom that I'll show you in a minute. But if you then wanted to, you could go into Photoshop and have more, thorough noise reduction using the software that you can get in Photoshop. But to be honest, for me, it's more about the emotion of the image that's there. And yes, there is a little bit of grain that's in the image, but I quite like that grain. So it's all a personal choice that you have to make. But let's have a look, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So these are images that I've taken at a recent wedding that I did. These are lovely because the groom is crying here. You can actually see the tear on his face there. Now, this is shot. Now, I was using the Tamron 28 to 75, and I wanted to set it on aperture mode and then shoot at 2.8. When I'm shooting outside and things, I do like to be in control. But because things are happening so very, very quickly inside a church and stuff like that, I often leave it on aperture mode. And I also set the cameras up that way for Kerry as well. She's not a techie, and it's just set so that she can really just point and shoot. But in these scenarios where I'm not going to be changing anything because it's basically all set, I just set it in aperture mode and let the ISO run to whatever I need. And I'm just constantly checking my histogram to make sure that I'm exposing correctly right through the whole thing. Now, you can also look inside your camera too, because if you check inside your camera at the bottom, what you will see is that you'll see when you're looking at your exposure that you'll have an exposure dial which is right at the bottom down here. Now, that should read 0.0. If you're 0.0 means it's sitting dead in the center. Now, you're okay to go a little bit over, which is even better. You certainly shouldn't go under. Now, these are all Kerry's photos that I'm going to show you today. But like I said, the camera's set up to how I've set it up for her, and I have no issues with it at all, as long as she's following that rule of being, trying to be dead on or a little bit over. Sometimes we do have to sort of increase the exposure a little bit, like I said, half a stop or something like that. And she just uses the exposure compensation dial to do that. And then I just turn the highlights down later on in post. And you can see what's happened here is that this exposure, I've just added 0.5 in the exposure. The highlights have actually come down due to the fact that I wanted to maintain as much detail as possible in these areas over here. And I've just allowed the image to run as it is. Now, yes, there is grain there. I mean, if I open this up, you're going to see grain. Let me show you. So this is the sort of grain that you're going to see inside this image. But does that bother me? Is it going to bother the bride? Is it going to bother the groom? No, it's not at all. And like I said, if I wanted to, I could take this into Photoshop, or even use some light reduction later on in Lightroom as well, because these are just as they were in the camera, apart from these settings that I've changed here. So what I'm more after is the ambient. I don't want to be firing off a flash in a church unless I have to, because the priests often don't like it. It can, well, it basically can upset the bride and groom and everyone else if there's flash exposures going off all over the place. And I've found that to me, it's more about the emotion of what I'm capturing here. So that's one image, and I'll show you as I scroll through some of these to give you the type of look that we're getting. So if I come back to this one, you'll notice that it's 1/320th of a second at 2.8. Now, I always like to set my shutter speed, and I'll do that through the menus. You can go faster, faster, and fastest. I've set it so that on my camera, it gives a fast shutter speed. Now, the reason why I do that is because I want the image to be very, very sharp. I don't want any movement to cause a ruined image. That's more important to me than showing a little bit of grain or something else. So I try and have the shutter speed up a decent amount to avoid that. Now, you'll notice the ISO, because it's on auto ISO, is pushed up to 10,000 ISO here. And a lot of people will go, whoa, it's too much. But like I said, this is a relative thing, and you really have to go with what you're comfortable with. I'm comfortable with my work, with working at these type of ISOs, as long as I'm not pushing the exposure up, because the images are clean enough for what I'm after. You can see here another one which is ISO 10,000, and again, it's more about the image that you can see here. Some others where it's just showing the bride walking in. You can see the lovely emotion on the mother's face and the groom's face here. Again, this is 12,800 ISO, so it's really pushing the ISO up. Now, I could have used flash and then reduced the ISO way down, but I'm happy with these results, and this is what I wanted to sort of show to people. This is another one where it's ISO 10,000 here as well, with the bride just walking in. Again, this is a whole room shot where it's ISO 4000. Again, the ISO is allowed to just run freely, as long as we're not overexposing. I've just made sure that I can keep as much detail as possible in the highlights, things like that. This is another one where it's ISO 12,800. Do you think anyone is going to look at these images and say they're not happy? The bride's not going to look at the fact that there's a slight amount of noise in this image. They're just going to look at the image itself, and there's nothing wrong with these images the way that they are. Again, the bride and groom kissing here, which is ISO 8000, and again another moment as they pull apart. There's another one where you can see that it's ISO 5000. Again, perfectly acceptable amount of noise. Again, too, this is another area where I like to use natural light, because you're seeing in the face around here the lovely colour coming in from the candles, which is starting to come through the bride here. You know, if you're firing flash off, it can stop the mood of these areas. And like I said, I just don't do it anymore. Even in receptions, I'm now using the ambient light, raising the ISO up, and just adding some continuous light as well. Again, this is another one where they're naturally being lit by the candle in here, because I'm using just the ambient light that's part of this. This is another one where they're being lit. Again, you can see the nice gold look on his face up through here. And again, this is ISO 6400, 1/200th of a second at 2.8. I've set the camera on 2.8 the whole way through. This only opens up to 2.8, so I've had to run with that. And then again, this is one where they're just leaving at the end, which is ISO 12,800. So it's really interesting. So I just wanted to show you that don't be too worried nowadays with the ISO of your cameras. If you're dealing with something like using any of the modern cameras, I can only really talk specifically about the Sonys though in this regard, but the A7 III, the A9, the A7 R4, slightly less because it is a little bit noisier, but those cameras like the A9, the A7 III, you can easily push the ISO. Like I said, I'm using 12,800 here, and I'm really happy with the results, as long as you're not underexposing, and that's the trick. A lot of people think you have to underexpose to maintain the highlights and bring that back later on. That won't work if you're dealing with exposing the way I have here. You have to expose almost exact, like this has been increased by 0.45 there, and the highlights have been dropped down. You can see if I bring them up, it's a bit too much, so I've brought the highlight down to keep as much detail as possible in the windows and the bride's dress and things like that. But I just thought I'll show you this just because I missed it. I'll show you that again there, that the highlight has been moved up there. I've dropped the highlight down a little bit and the shadows have just been increased a little bit. So let me know what you think. I just wanted to answer this question that a lot of people ask, is how do your images stay so clean? And I wanted to sort of discuss that it really is more about exposing dead center, or if you can, expose a little bit to the right. These were Kerry's images. I would have probably exposed a little bit more to the right, and then I could have brought the exposure even down a little bit. But like I said, I'm completely happy with what Kerry's got here, and I'm sure that the bride and groom are going to love all of these images that she's captured here with high ISO, f2.8, and with a decent shutter speed that's going to make sure everything is frozen and nice and sharp. Let me know if you have any questions down below. I'd love to know your thoughts about this, and I'll see you all soon in the next video. Bye for now.